Seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus said that one time. It's a true statement. It's a true statement for a lot of father-son combos. It may not be true for you, but it is true for me. When my dad was 21 years old, he was 6'3" and 160 pounds. When I was 21 years old, I was 6'5" and 160 pounds. If I turned sideways, you could see through me. My dad thought it was really cool when he hit 200 pounds, which I thought it was really cool when I finally hit 200 pounds. Like I wasn't like a stick figure, right? But my dad didn't think it was nearly as cool when he hit 250 pounds, and I did not think it was nearly as cool when I hit 250 pounds. Right? It's more than just our appearance, though. I mean, we share a similar personality. We tend to be generally upbeat, full of joy, like laughter. We enjoy fun. We're laid back, kind of relaxed. But also my dad has this thing about him where when he talks, you wonder if he has a filter, right? And he says he does, but it really just kind of scares you as to what kinds of things he isn't saying, right? And so he's got some of that, and he's aware of it, and he's actually very comfortable with it. Sometimes I can say some things that probably should have stayed in my head. My mom says that I'm just like my dad, and she's right, except that when she says it like it's an accusation. Feels like she's trying to hurt me with those words, but it doesn't hurt me, probably because I'm like my dad, right? And I take her accusations as compliments because my mom really likes my dad. My dad is kind of my mom's favorite person, so like, if I'm just like him, then that makes me number 2, right? That's pretty great. Now, can you relate? Are you your father's son? Or are you your mother's daughter? Maybe you've tried your entire life to break away from the generations that came before you. For some of us, this conversation isn't funny or positive. It's actually painful and difficult. Maybe addictions or struggles or sins have been passed down for generations, and maybe you've done everything you can to distance yourself from your father or to break away from your mother. And so are you a chip off the old block? Are you an apple that didn't fall far from the tree? Or are you the apple that landed and rolled as far away as you could possibly get? Do people look at you and say, like father, like son? And what about the opposite view? What are your kids revealing about you? What do your kids reveal to the people who live around you? What do they reveal about who you are? Because we can talk about physical traits and we can talk about personality traits, but your kids are probably revealing your character. They're probably revealing your values. They're probably revealing what mission you are on in life. Hang on to that idea. We're going to come back to it. Over the next few weeks, we're going to do a sermon series focused on Jesus, but we're kind of taking a strange path. We're going to look at Jesus, but from the book of Psalms, which means that we're going to be talking about some Old Testament prophecy. Now, when we use that word prophecy, it can mean several different things. Most of the time, we think of prophecy as being future telling, and it can be sometimes. But most of the time, prophecy is just a simple communication of a special message from God. In fact, we said it this way last week. It just kind of came up as a side note, but prophecy is a miraculous spiritual gift where people receive revelation from God, meaning God gives them something that they wouldn't know or that they wouldn't understand other than God miraculously speaking to them. And then the one who receives this message is expected to speak the message. The message is for the community. It's for God's people. It's not even necessarily for the person who receives it from God. And so they speak the message, and they do so under divine inspiration. Prophecy is an act of truth-telling. And most of the time, truth doesn't feel nice. Usually when God authors a prophecy, it serves as a warning to shape up or he's going to show up. And so most of the time, prophecy reveals truth. But as we said before, sometimes prophecy is telling something about the future. That's usually what we think about when it comes to prophecy. Sometimes prophecy is telling what will specifically happen in the future. And even when we have this first category, even when prophecy is about a message from God, it can still be future related because it's trying to impact the future. It's telling the truth in a way to help you correct behavior and fix the future. There's also a third type of prophecy. There's lots of different ways or words that we could use to refer to it, but we'll call it this, typological. And this is referring to the kind of stuff that people didn't know was prophecy until something happens much later to fulfill it. This is what the New Testament writers saw all the time. They would apply Old Testament texts to Jesus. Even when it seems like the Old Testament texts weren't being predictive and they weren't about the Messiah and it wasn't something about the future, the New Testament writers watched what Jesus did and then they looked back in their old scriptures and they saw correlation and they saw fulfillment. Now, it doesn't mean that the Old Testament texts were only about Jesus. In fact, as we go through these, you'll see there's events of the Old Testament that tell the story of those who were involved. But the New Testament writers used those stories as if they were there to serve as a preview, kind of as a type, if you will, right? That later was going to be fulfilled to a greater extent down the road. So those old stories are pointing forward to something bigger. Jesus is frequently seen as the fulfillment to those stories. What's true in the past has become even more true in Jesus. And so we're going to be looking at the book of Psalms and different statements that end up being predictive shadows of Jesus. Today we're going to look at some writings that are very clearly about David. But years later, the New Testament writers point out that even though those statements are true for David, they become even more true for Jesus. And so there's something very real about David when the words were written, and yet to a greater extent, those same words become fulfilled in Jesus. And so words in Psalms end up being a simple shadow of a greater fulfillment well beyond the time that the words were written. And if you want some more depth on all of these things, I want to encourage you to dig back into this Core 52 book. We started the year out sharing this resource with you, encouraging you to get involved. Maybe you started reading and then you stopped, right? Or maybe you never got the resource, but now I'm talking about, so now you're curious. Find your way to get one of these. We still have a few of them around here in the building. Maybe you've been reading and you've kept up with it, and everything that I've said so far today sounds very familiar, like you've already been reading it, right? The next few weeks, we're going to actually kind of step into this book and kind of walk along with it for a few chapters, chapters 10 through 13 of Core 52, 4 different chapters in the book of Psalms, and different pictures that are laid out of Jesus, okay? Today we're going to be looking specifically at Psalm 2. And what's really interesting about Psalm 2 is that there's multiple prophecies that happen just in this one chapter, 3 different typological prophecies, okay? First one happens in the first 2 verses. It says, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed." Now those statements are true for David and his experiences. And it became even more true for Jesus. King David in the Old Testament fought his whole life. He fought wild animals when he was a young boy working as a shepherd. He fought Goliath, and then he became a warrior who led men into battle for the nation of Israel. He fought against Israel's king, a guy named King Saul, not because David himself was trying to take him out, but more because Saul felt threatened by David and his success. And so Saul followed and searched and sought out to kill David for a very long time. And then eventually David became king himself, and he was a warrior king. He was the kind of king that fought against other nations for the safety and the security and the advancement of his nation of Israel. And so David faced nations and peoples and kings and rulers. He faced them all. The New Testament writers saw the same thing with Jesus. There's a moment in the book of Acts after Peter and John are put through a strange trial before the religious political leaders, and after they get released, they go back to their church community. They begin to pray together. And in that prayer, they quote Psalm 2. They pray, "Why did the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed one." And then in their prayer, they add to all of this their context. Very next verse, they say, indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. And so you have nations, the Gentiles. They mention the peoples, the Jews. They mention kings, Herod. And they mention rulers, Pilate. Nations, peoples, kings, rulers. These writers of the New Testament use David as a type for Jesus. Verse 9 of Psalm 2 is another one. It says, you will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Now that's true of David. I mean, he ruled as a mighty warrior. He defeated his enemies that came up against him. And it will be true of Jesus. This is one of those prophecies that's still kind of hanging out there, hasn't quite been fulfilled. This verse is quoted 3 different times in the book of Revelation. And it tells us that the way Jesus carried himself in the Gospels will not be the way that he shows back up at the end. His life and his death and his resurrection serve as an invitation for people to follow him, but his return will feel very different. It's not going to serve the same purpose. He's going to rule. And anyone who would deny him or oppose him isn't going to stand a chance. And so 2 pictures of Jesus fulfilling these types of David that were true for him, but became truer for Jesus. There's a 3rd picture in Psalm 2 that I want us to spend some time on today. Verse 7 says, I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Now for David, as you read these words, it sounds like God is making a statement of support. Like God is drawing a line in the sand, that God's got David's back. God has picked a side, and it isn't good for you if you're on the other side. This verse is used 2 different times, 2 different situations in the Gospels. And both times that this verse is used, it's language that's pointed toward Jesus. This typological type of a thing. So the first one takes place in Matthew 3, Mark 1, and Luke 3. And it's early on in the Gospels. Jesus hasn't really even begun his ministry yet. And this is kind of the scene where it all takes off. He gets baptized. He's coming out of the water. We're told that the heavens split, which is weird. The sky just kind of opens up, and something comes out of the sky, and it lands on Jesus. It's weird. It's a weird thing to experience. It's a weird thing to see, which means that the language used to explain it probably isn't going to satisfy the curiosity you have of what's actually happening here. Some sort of a spiritual or a supernatural event. But what the writers come up with is that something looking like a dove floats down, lands on Jesus. We're told it's the Holy Spirit. And when that happens, a voice, an audible voice from heaven that was understandable by everyone who was there, speaks out. And it says, you are my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. And it sounds kind of like Psalm 2:7. Sounds like God is making a statement of support. The second time Psalm 2 is quoted is in Matthew 17, Mark 9, and Luke 9. It's an event called the Transfiguration. Jesus goes up on a mountain with 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John. And something supernatural happens to Jesus' physical appearance. We're told that his face starts shining and his clothes become white like light. Jesus doesn't reflect light, but something strange happens in him where he becomes a source of light that is flowing out of him, which is very strange. And then we're told Moses and Elijah show up, which is even more strange, maybe, because they've been dead for a very long time. All right? It's kind of weird. Makes me wonder, how did Peter, James, and John know that it was Moses and Elijah? Like they'd never met before? How do you recognize them? What was that like? Maybe when they show up, Jesus recognizes them because like he's God, and so he knows stuff. And so like maybe he sees them and he thinks, oh yeah, this is Moses and Elijah. Maybe he calls them by name. I don't know what it is. But these 2 other guys show up, Moses and Elijah. Jesus is shining. It's all really weird. And they're just hanging out, the 3 of them having a conversation, while it feels like Peter, James, and John are standing off to the side just watching this mind blown, right? And in the middle of this already very strange event, a voice from heaven booms out and says, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And it sounds like God is making a point. Like he's making a point to specifically get to the disciples who are witnessing all of this. It feels kind of like God's drawing a line in the sand. It feels kind of like maybe God's got Jesus' back. It feels like maybe God has picked a side, and you'd better be on the right side. It feels kind of like that. God only speaks 3 times in the Gospels. The third one happens in John 12 when Jesus is talking, and he kind of, in the middle of it, just kind of offers this prayer to God, and then God responds to his prayer with an audible voice to confirm that he's on the same page with Jesus and what he's praying for, which is all very strange, right? But other than that, when God speaks in the Gospels, he does so to make a very big deal about Jesus being his son. Why is it such a big deal to see Jesus as God's son? Is it necessary to believe that Jesus is literally the Son of God, or is that figurative language? Could Jesus have accomplished everything he did? Could he have made the same impact on the world? Could he have changed the course of history in the same kind of a way without technically being God's son? Why do we insist on Jesus being the Son of God? Why is this a big deal? Why does God call Jesus his son 2 separate times? Well, guys, this is bigger than a declaration of God's approval. This is bigger than God picking sides. This is an affirmation of Jesus' regal heritage. This is God saying that Jesus is the rightful heir to the throne of Israel. 1,000 years before Jesus was born, the Bible predicted that the Messiah was going to show up. And we're going to talk about the importance of the Messiah here in a couple weeks. But just as a quick introduction, the word Messiah means anointed one. It's language used of princes and kings. It's coronation language type of stuff. And Israel held on tightly to the promise that one day there would be a Messiah. There would be a king who would sit on David's throne, and he would rescue Israel just like Moses had. And they believed that somehow this Messiah king was going to bless all nations like what had been promised to Abraham. And so when God says, "You are my son," when God says, "This is my son," what the disciples heard was, this is the rightful heir to David's throne. The king has shown up. God's promises are fulfilled. And it's a big deal to see Jesus as God's son. But it's even bigger than that. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus tells a story of a vineyard owner. The vineyard owner has to leave. He has to go away on a business trip, and he's going to be gone for some time. He's going to kind of miss an entire season of work at his vineyard, and so he rents it out to some local farmers. And as he's gone, for this long time, eventually it becomes time to harvest. And so he sends a couple of his representatives back to the vineyard to check and see how things were going and to collect. I mean, he's the owner. He's due a portion of the harvest. And so he sends them to collect so that he can receive. But it doesn't go well. The first representative is rejected and beaten. He's sent back. And so the owner sends another representative and another one. And it escalates each time to the point of representatives being killed. The vineyard owner sees all this playing out from afar. He knows that he has to do something about it. He can't just back off because it's his vineyard. Something has to be done. And so he sends his son. He decides to send someone that they can't reject, someone they can't mistreat, someone they can't pretend doesn't have the right to be there because he's the son. And the son doesn't just represent the father, he is the father. The son isn't some sort of a hired hand. The son is the owner of the vineyard because the father is the owner of the vineyard. The son and the father are one. They're one and the same, right? And as Jesus tells the story, the farmers kill the son. And the main reason for telling the story that Jesus gives has to do with how Israel had been receiving these messengers from God a long time, called prophets. God sent prophets and they were rejected, some of them even killed. And Jesus is telling this audience, now God has sent his son. And Jesus predicts that they're going to do the same thing to him that they had done to everybody else before. He says they're going to refuse to listen to God's son, that they're going to kill God's son. And that's the biggest idea out of this parable. But there's another important idea out of it, at least for us today. A son reveals the Father. A son represents the Father. A son is the Father. The Father is the Son. Remember, we talked just a moment ago about parents and attributes of theirs that we carry on. And we even asked the question, what do your kids reveal to your community about who you are? Because they reveal stuff about us, don't they? A parent isn't perfectly responsible for everything that a child may do, but to a great extent, your children reveal who you are to the world around you, right, wrong, or indifferent. They reveal your character. They reveal your values. They reveal what mission you may be on in this world. And so it's a really big deal that we would see Jesus as God's son. It's so important that the Gospels use that language over and over and over again. It's important for us to see that Jesus revealed to us in very practical terms who God is. Jesus revealed God's character and his values and his mission and stuff like this. And this is not a comprehensive list, but here's just a few of the things that Jesus revealed to us of who God is. Because of Jesus, we know that God is a loving Father. There were hints of it in the Old Testament, but the relationship with God looked more like fear and trembling. Jesus is the one who shows us this attribute of God in very real, practical ways. Jesus repeatedly calls God Father in a way that felt offensive to the people who were hearing it because it was intimate, like almost too intimate. Like he called God Abba, which sounded kind of more like dad or daddy. And he showed God's love through actions like welcoming children or forgiving sinners. Jesus is the one who gives us the words of John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Jesus shows us God is not distant or harsh, but is deeply affectionate and pursuing. And so Jesus revealed God's character. He's a loving Father. And if you see the Son, then you see the Father. Because of Jesus, we know that God is holy and righteous. And this isn't contradictory to the Old Testament. Holiness and righteousness are big attributes, focused attributes of God. But Jesus lived it out and showed us what it should look like. And so Jesus upheld God's perfect holiness while confronting sin directly. He taught that God's name is holy, and he called people to reflect God's righteousness. And yet his holiness isn't cold. It's paired with grace. He embodied sinless purity while he was eating and living with sinners. Jesus revealed God's character. He is holy and righteous. And if you see the Son, you see the Father. Because of Jesus, we know that God is compassionate and merciful. There's hints of this throughout the Old Testament, but it comes to life with Jesus. Jesus demonstrated mercy towards the outcasts, and so the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the lepers, and the sick. He said things like, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. He said, I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And he healed freely. He fed the hungry. He wept with mourners. And if you want to know what God's like, then you look at Jesus. Jesus revealed God's values. He's compassionate and merciful. And if you've seen the Son, then you've seen the Father. Because of Jesus, we know that God is relational and he seeks communion with us. The Old Testament God is kind of seen that way, but he's also distant. There's times when he's living with the nation of Israel in the desert and in the temple, and yet he's separate. He's set apart. He's different. But when Jesus shows up, he shows us that God desires a loving, eternal relationship. Jesus' prayers and his obedience modeled intimate fellowship with God. Jesus taught us that God desires relationship with us, not just rule following. Jesus even lived in community with people while on this earth. Jesus revealed God's values. He is relational with us. And if you've seen the Son, then you've seen the Father. Because of Jesus, we know that God is just and hates evil. And that one fits very well with the Old Testament, but Jesus shows up and shows us what it looks like in real practical terms. He warns of judgment for unrepentant sin, and he also speaks of God's justice in parables like the parable of the unforgiving servant. He shows God's hatred of hypocrisy and his hatred of exploitation while still offering forgiveness to those who hear and repent. He opens eyes to the fact that God's hatred of evil can exist even among God's people, that there isn't some sort of a birthright that protects you or saves you. Jesus revealed to us God's values, that he is just and that he hates evil, and he wants us to do good and to pursue righteousness. And if you've seen the Son, then you've seen the Father. Because of Jesus, we know that God is good and generous. God isn't always viewed that way in the Old Testament, at least not to everyone. And yet, Jesus taught us that no one is good except God alone. Jesus affirms God's inherent goodness. He illustrates this kind of stuff with his teachings on God's provision and his generosity, and that God gives good gifts freely. Jesus revealed God's mission, that he wants to be a good and generous God to all people. And if you've seen the Son, then you've seen the Father. Because of Jesus, we know that God is a Savior who rescues. We see that in pieces in the Old Testament, but it was always about physical rescuing. It was always about locational, spatial rescuing. But when Jesus arrived, he showed us that it was about something much bigger. And so through his miracles and his teachings, and then especially through Jesus' work on the cross and his resurrection, Jesus shows that God's commitment to redeem and restore was first and foremost. Jesus came with a mission. He came to seek and to save the lost, to declare victory over sin and death. That was Jesus' mission, and he came representing the Father. He revealed God's mission to save and to rescue. These are not some sort of characteristics of some random guy who existed 2,000 years ago. These are the truths of who our God is, played out in real, practical flesh and bone in the personhood of Jesus. He is God's Son. And if you see the Son, then you see the Father. Jesus shifted our understanding of God from something abstract and fearsome, like he's often seen in the Old Testament, to something that is very personal and approachable and overwhelmingly loving. And yet, Jesus never compromised his holiness or his justice. Jesus didn't just tell us about God's character. He lived it out so that we could see and know and trust it deeply. God gave us something tangible. Jesus changes how we relate to God. He moves us from fear or duty to confident love and dependence. And wouldn't you like to have a relationship with a God like that? If you've ever wanted to know what God is truly like, then you look at Jesus. And that's exactly what Jesus said in John 14. It's where we started at the beginning. He was talking to his disciples. They asked him a question, and he tells them, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, which is simple enough, right? But then he keeps going, and he says, if you really know me, then you're going to know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him, which is kind of hard to understand. It's a little bit confusing, and Philip, one of the disciples, is confused. It's kind of strange language, and so he responds, Lord, don't just show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. And that makes sense to me. I understand that statement. He says, let us see God. That'll be enough for us. And Jesus asks him, don't you know me, Philip? Have you seen me, Philip? Have you looked into my eyes, Philip? Have you heard my voice? Have you hugged my neck? Have you eaten meals with me? Have you lived with me? Philip, have we disagreed at times? Have we laughed together? Have we cried together? Don't you know me, Philip? And Jesus says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Do you know the Father? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you don't, I'll tell you, just start with the Son. Because if you've seen the Son, then you've seen the Father. If you know the Son, then you know the Father. And the biggest reason why we believe that Jesus is the Son is not necessarily because of any of these things that he taught. It's not even these things that we've looked at that reveal the nature of who God is. It's the fact that Jesus, 3 days after he was publicly and brutally murdered, walked out of a tomb. The resurrection is what makes everything else believable. And so, do you know the Son? Would you like to know the Son? I don't know where you're at. I don't know what your relationship with Jesus may look like and what level of curiosity you may have in God, but I'd like to encourage you to not ignore an opportunity to pursue him. Maybe that looks like a conversation. Maybe you've got questions. Maybe you want to know what it looks like to begin having a relationship with Jesus. I'd love to have that conversation with you and walk you through that. Maybe you need some prayer, some encouragement. I'll be sitting right up here. I'd love to do that with you. We also have an elder back in the prayer room who'd love to pray with you if you got something you want to talk about. Do you know the Son? Do you know the Father? If not, now would be a good time to be introduced. Why don't you stand and let's worship.